She drew a fake seam up the back of her bare leg with an eyebrow pencil, not knowing a distant war had already rewritten every rule in her closet. This was not vanity. This was a decade when the government told women exactly how many inches of fabric their skirts were allowed to have, and women dressed beautifully anyway, with less than any generation before or since. Nobody stood over them with a rulebook. There was no law that said you had to wear a hat to the grocery store, and yet almost every woman did. That is the puzzle worth sitting with tonight. In March of 1942, the War Production Board issued an order with a name almost nobody remembers now, General Limitation Order L-85, and it reached into every dress shop and tailor's workroom in the country. No extra fabric for cuffs, no wide lapels, no double-breasted suits with matching vests. The government was measuring the width of a woman's hem in inches because every spare yard of wool was needed for a soldier's coat. Picture the tailor's chalk marks on a bolt of navy wool and a government order sitting on the counter beside it like a second customer nobody invited. No patch pockets, no trouser cuffs, no extra seams for shaping a jacket. Every detail we now call classic 40s tailoring, that narrow, no-nonsense silhouette, was not a style choice. It was a legal ceiling on how much cloth one person was permitted to wear. The rule was never written down in any book she owned, but every woman on that street corner knew it anyway. You did not leave the house without a hat. Not for church, not for the doctor, not for a 10-minute errand to buy thread. A bare head in public was not illegal. It was simply unthinkable, the way it is unthinkable now to answer the door in your pajamas when the mailman rings twice. Emily Post's Etiquette guide, revised and reprinted through the decade, treated a hatless woman downtown the way we might treat someone showing up to a job interview in gym clothes. It was not scandalous. It was simply a signal, read instantly by every stranger who passed her, that something about her had slipped. Clothes in this era were a language everyone spoke fluently, and going out improperly dressed was like mispronouncing your own name. Here is the part that surprises people every time I explain it. Women in this decade owned far fewer clothes than we do now. One good suit, a handful of blouses, a single decent pair of shoes she resoled twice before replacing them. The dressed-up look people remember from old photographs did not come from closets full of options. It came from care applied relentlessly to almost nothing. A woman might wear the same navy suit to church on Sunday, to a job interview on Monday, and to a friend's engagement party on Saturday, and no one would think less of her for it. What changed was the collar she pinned on, the brooch she chose, the way she rolled her hair that morning. The suit was a canvas. Everything else was the argument that she had made an effort. Nylon had barely existed before this decade began. DuPont introduced it in 1940, and within 2 years, nearly all of it disappeared from store shelves, not because women stopped wanting stockings, but because the military needed it for parachutes and parachute cord. Silk vanished for the same reason. A woman's bare legs became, almost overnight, a wartime shortage with a face. So women improvised, and the improvisation is the part nobody quite believes until they see the photographs. A tinted leg makeup, sold under names promising a stocking's warm tan color, went on like lotion from ankle to thigh. Then came the part that required a second pair of hands, a sister or a roommate kneeling behind her, drawing a straight seam up the back of her calf with an eyebrow pencil, so from 10 feet away in the right light it read as a real stocking seam. It disappeared from polite company decades ago, but it still works as a story because it tells you everything about how this generation solved a problem. They did not lower the standard because the material ran out. They found another way to meet it. A pencil line on the back of a leg was not a shortcut. It was proof that giving up on looking presentable was never considered an option worth entertaining. The British called it make do and mend, a phrase coined in a 1943 government pamphlet, but the practice belonged just as much to American women, who never needed a slogan to know what mending a torn hem at the kitchen table after supper meant. It meant the dress had one more season left in it. It meant you were not the kind of woman who threw a garment away because it had a flaw. The Singer Sewing Machine Company ran classes across the country teaching exactly this skill, dressed up with a patriotic name. Sew for Victory, they called it, and women packed church basements and community halls to learn how to take a pre-war dress, heavy with extra fabric now illegal to manufacture, and cut it down into something narrower, shorter, and perfectly within the new rules. An old dress did not retire. It was reborn as a legal one. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down. A dress with a torn seam was not trash. It was a project with an hour of work left in it. That instinct, to repair rather than replace, to see a garment as worth saving, sat underneath the whole culture of dressing well in this decade. The clothes people remember as elegant were very often the same clothes worn for 3, 4, 5 years running. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore, and part of it is this. Looking presentable during hardship was treated as a form of character, not a luxury for people with money to spare. Magazines and advice columns of the era said it plainly. Letting yourself go while the country was at war was framed as a kind of quiet failure. Keeping up your appearance was framed as quiet resilience. Think about what that means for a moment. A woman who ironed her one good blouse before catching the streetcar to a factory job was not performing for anyone in particular. She was participating in something larger than her own reflection, a shared civic posture that said the war had not broken the country's spirit, one pressed collar at a time. That is a heavier meaning than we usually give a blouse credit for. Now picture the opposite end of that spirit, worn on a man's back instead of a woman's. The Zoot suit, with its wide-pegged trousers and its long, broad-shouldered jacket, used far more fabric than any rationed garment was supposed to. To wear one during the war was to make a visible, deliberate statement, and by the summer of 1943, that statement had turned into something dangerous. In June of 1943, in Los Angeles, young Mexican-American and black men wearing Zoot suits were attacked over several nights by off-duty servicemen and civilians who saw the excess fabric as an insult to wartime sacrifice. It is a hard chapter, and I will not dwell on the violence of it here, but it belongs in this story because it proves the point better than any etiquette column could. Clothing in this decade was never just clothing. It was read, judged, and sometimes punished as a public statement. For most Americans, though, the statement clothing made was quieter and far less fraught. It said simply, "I have not given up." A woman standing at a bus stop in a neatly pressed suit and a small, correctly angled hat was not trying to impress a stranger. She was proving something to herself in a decade that gave people very little room to prove much of anything. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works. The idea that how you dress for an ordinary Tuesday says something about how seriously you take your own life. Department store catalogs of the decade, the kind that arrived thick as a phone book, did not just sell party dresses. They sold traveling costumes for train trips, suits for grocery errands, and dresses specifically described as suitable for calling on the doctor. Nothing was too small an occasion to dress correctly for. Imagine flipping through that catalog with your mother at the kitchen table, deciding which suit would do double duty for church and for the 5 o'clock train to visit your aunt. There was no separate wardrobe for errands and a wardrobe for occasions. There was one wardrobe, and every use of it was treated as worth a little effort, because in public, on a streetcar or a train platform, you were always visible to someone. Train travel especially demanded this. A woman boarding a train in 1944 wore a suit, gloves, and a hat, not because a conductor required it, but because a train platform was a small, temporary society, full of strangers forming instant impressions of one another. Dressing correctly for that platform was a form of good manners toward people she would never see again. It said, I respect this shared space enough to show up properly for it. There is a quiet indignation worth sitting with here. We have traded that instinct for something far more anonymous. Now we can move through a crowded airport, a grocery store, a train car, in whatever we happen to grab off the floor that morning, and feel no obligation to the strangers around us at all. The 1940s version of good manners understood something we have mostly forgotten, that showing up decently dressed in public is a small gift to everyone else in the room. Let us go back to that mirror for a moment, because there is more to unpack in how she got ready than the stockings alone. Rationing did not just limit fabric. It limited leather for shoes, rubber for elastic, even the metal in hooks and buttons. A woman getting fully dressed in 1943 was assembling an outfit from a supply chain stretched thinner than most of us can now imagine. Shoes were rationed too, limited to a set number of pairs per person per year, which is why women's magazines of the period ran endless articles on shoe care, on resoling instead of replacing, on rotating your two pairs so neither wore out too fast. A scuffed toe was not a small cosmetic flaw. It was a sign that your ration coupons might run out before the year did. So the woman at the mirror was not simply vain or fashionable. She was resourceful in a way that took real skill, stretching a handful of rationed materials into an outfit that met a social expectation nobody had to explain to her twice. That is the through line of this whole story. Scarcity did not lower the standard. It raised the value of every small correct detail she managed to pull off. Men were held to their own version of this, and it is worth saying plainly because we tend to remember the decade as a story about women's fashion alone. A man leaving the house without a hat, a jacket, and a properly knotted tie was making a statement almost as loud as a bareheaded woman downtown. Even factory workers changed out of their work clothes before running an errand on the way home. A father heading to the corner drugstore for a newspaper might still put on his jacket first, even if he had just come home and taken it off 10 minutes earlier. It was not comfort that governed the decision. It was the understanding that stepping outside your own front door meant stepping into a shared, observed space, and that space had its own dress code, unwritten but universally understood. Children were folded into this early too. A boy's church trousers were kept separate from his play trousers, ironed and hung on their own hook because the distinction between occasions mattered enough to teach a 6-year-old. A girl learned to smooth her skirt and check her hair before answering the front door, not because anyone expected a guest, but because you never quite knew who might be standing there. This is where the without pressure part of tonight's story really lives. Nobody sat these children down and delivered a lecture about the social contract of dress. They absorbed it the way you absorb a language spoken around you from birth, by watching their mother check the hem of her skirt before opening the door, by watching their father reach for his jacket before a 5-minute errand, over and over, until it needed no explanation at all. That is how an entire generation learned a standard nobody ever had to enforce with a raised voice. It was reinforced constantly and gently, at church on Sunday, at the dinner table, on the walk to school, until dressing properly stopped feeling like a rule at all and simply felt like who you were. That is a very different kind of pressure than the pressure we usually imagine, and honestly, a gentler one. Let us talk about what actually happened to that fabric the government was saving. Every inch spared from a woman's hemline or a man's trouser cuff went somewhere specific, into uniforms, parachutes, tents, and bandages. This was not an abstract sacrifice. A shorter skirt in Ohio had a direct, traceable line to a soldier's coat in the Pacific, and women understood that connection because the government made sure they did. Wartime posters and radio announcements hammered this point home constantly, tying a woman's decision about her hemline directly to the war effort in a way that made dressing modestly feel less like restriction and more like participation. She was not simply told to wear less fabric. She was told her restraint mattered, that it counted toward something real, and that framing changed everything about how the sacrifice felt. Good manners remember, even when we forget. And this is exactly the kind of forgotten connective tissue this channel exists to dig back up. Dressing well in the 1940s was never a separate topic from patriotism, thrift, faith, or family duty. It was woven into all of them at once, which is exactly why it needed no separate rule book. It was simply what a decent person did, in every direction you looked. Now let us follow the story forward, because this is where the rules finally start to loosen. The war ended in the summer of 1945, and rationing controls did not vanish overnight, but they began to ease gradually over the following year. Fabric that had been locked away for military use slowly started reappearing in dress shop windows, and something in the culture shifted right along with it. Then in February of 1947, a French designer named Christian Dior unveiled a collection in Paris that would end up defining the rest of the decade. He called it simply his new collection, but the press quickly nicknamed it the New Look, and it reversed nearly everything rationing had trained women to expect. Full skirts, cinched waists, yards and yards of fabric where there had barely been enough for one dress before. Some American commentators actually criticized it at first, arguing it felt wasteful so soon after years of rationing sacrifice, a strange little controversy that only makes sense once you understand how morally loaded fabric yardage had become during the war. A wider skirt was not just a design choice to them. It was practically a political statement about whether the hardship years were finally, truly over. Within a couple of years, though, the objections faded and the new look won completely. American department stores adapted it for mass production, and by the very end of the decade, the narrow, rationed silhouette of the war years had all but disappeared from ordinary closets, replaced by the fuller, more feminine shape most people now picture when they imagine 40s and 50s glamour, even though it really only arrived at the finish line. It is worth pausing here to correct something people get wrong constantly about this decade. The glamorous 40s look most of us picture: red lipstick, sweeping skirts, sculpted hair, mostly belongs to Hollywood costuming and to those last 2 or 3 post-war years, not to the plainer, rationed years that made up the bulk of the decade. The real 40s, for most ordinary women, were modest, careful, and often mended more than once. So when people imagine this decade as one long, glamorous newsreel, they are usually picturing the tail end of it, borrowed from movie stars and magazine covers, layered on top of what most women were actually wearing on an ordinary Tuesday. The truth is quieter and, honestly, more impressive. Looking put together with almost nothing takes far more skill than looking put together with everything. Let us return to the parlor for a moment, because dressing up was never just about stepping outside the front door. Women dressed for company inside their own homes, too, changing into a fresh house dress and combing their hair before a guest was even expected, simply because the doorbell might ring, and being caught looking careless in your own front room was its own small social failure. A house dress itself had rules. It was not the same as an outdoor dress, but it was still expected to be clean, pressed, and presentable enough for an unannounced neighbor. The apron went on over it for cooking and came off the moment company arrived. These were small, constant adjustments made all day long, so quietly that the woman making them probably never once thought of it as effort. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore, and the apron ritual is a perfect example. Nobody wrote a manual explaining exactly when to remove an apron. A daughter simply watched her mother do it for years, 100 times over, until the timing became instinct rather than instruction. That is how most of this decade's dress code actually spread, not through rules, but through repetition witnessed young. Grooming carried the same weight as clothing itself. A woman's hair, set the night before in pin curls and brushed out each morning, was treated as seriously as her wardrobe, because an unkempt hairstyle undid a perfectly pressed suit just as thoroughly as a stain would have. The whole presentation had to hold together, from the crown of her head to the seam drawn up the back of her leg. Beauty parlors, where they existed and could be afforded, were treated less like indulgence and more like maintenance, the same way you might get a car service today. A weekly or bi-weekly set kept a woman's hair looking cared for even when her wardrobe options were thin, which mattered more, not less, in a decade when clothing itself had to stretch so far. Let us slow down on a specific afternoon because I think it makes the whole idea land harder than any list of facts could. A woman is invited to her neighbor's home for coffee. Nothing formal, just an ordinary weekday visit. She still puts on a clean dress, checks her hair, and brings a small hostess gift, because showing up plainly for something as small as coffee would have felt, to her, like an insult to the friendship. That instinct, treating a small social occasion with the same care as a large one, is maybe the single clearest thread running through this entire decade. There was no such thing, in her mind, as an occasion too minor to deserve effort. Every visit, every errand, every doorbell ring was a small test of character, and she passed it quietly, almost every single day of her life. Compare that, just for a moment, to how casually we treat the same kind of visit now. We answer the door in sweatpants without a second thought, and nobody blinks because the expectation itself disappeared somewhere along the way. I am not saying that is a moral failure on anyone's part today. I am saying something real was lost in the exchange, and most of us never noticed it leaving. Working women faced their own version of this discipline, and there were more of them in this decade than in any before it, stepping into factories and offices while men were overseas. A woman on a factory floor building airplane parts still followed a dress code, safety-conscious trousers and tied-back hair for the machinery, but she changed into her presentable clothes the moment her shift ended, before she ever stepped back into public. That transition, from work clothes to public clothes, happened every single day for millions of women who had never worked outside the home before the war pulled them into it. They did not treat the factory uniform as their new public identity. It was practical, temporary, and left behind at the locker the moment the whistle blew, because the standard for how a woman appeared in public had not moved an inch just because her job had. There is a version of this story people love to romanticize into something oppressive, as though every woman resented every hat and every pencil-drawn seam as a burden forced upon her. I do not think that reading holds up well against the record. Most women of this era describe the standard not as a cage, but as a shared language, one that let a stranger on a train platform instantly understand who you were trying to be. There is quiet indignation underneath that observation, though, and I will not hide it from you. The fact that this standard was carried almost entirely by women, absorbed young, maintained daily, often under real material hardship, and then handed to the next generation without a word of thanks, deserves to be named plainly. This was skilled, disciplined, invisible labor, and it rarely gets remembered as labor at all. It also cost real money, even in its most modest form. Fabric prices climbed during the shortage years, and a new dress could take a meaningful bite out of a household budget already strained by wartime prices on nearly everything else. Choosing to mend rather than replace was not purely sentimental. It was often the only financially sound choice a family had, dressed up in the language of thrift and virtue. None of that erases the genuine warmth in this story, though, and I do not want it to. There is real affection owed to a generation of women who took a legal fabric shortage and turned it into an art form of care and attention, who taught their daughters to see a torn hem as a puzzle rather than a disaster, and who somehow made looking presentable feel like an act of love rather than a chore. Let us talk about children's clothing for a moment, because rationing reached even into the nursery. A growing child outgrowing a coat every season was a genuine problem when fabric was legally capped, so hand-me-downs stopped being a sign of a struggling family and became, quite simply, standard practice across every income level. The oldest child's outgrown coat became the second child's new coat, without any embarrassment attached to it at all. This changes how we should read old family photographs. That slightly oversized coat on the younger child in a 1944 snapshot is not evidence of poverty. It is evidence of an entirely ordinary practice that cut across nearly every household in the country, rich and poor alike, because the fabric restrictions did not care how much money a family had in the bank. Weddings during the war years followed the same logic, and this always surprises people who imagine every 1940s wedding photo showing an enormous white gown. Fabric restrictions made a full traditional wedding dress genuinely difficult to obtain. So many brides married in a smart suit instead, or in a borrowed gown passed carefully between sisters and cousins over several years, each one adding her own small alteration. A single wedding gown in some families was worn by 3 or 4 different brides across the decade, quietly altered each time to fit the next bride's shape and the next season's small style shifts. That dress was not treated as a costume borrowed once and returned. It was treated almost like a family heirloom in motion, carrying a little bit of every wedding it had already witnessed into the next one. Funerals, on the other end of life, carried their own strict dress expectations too, and this is worth mentioning because it shows the code was not limited to happy occasions. Black or dark, modest, carefully pressed clothing was simply what you wore, regardless of how little else you owned, because showing respect through appearance mattered most precisely when the occasion mattered most. So, the dress code of this decade was not really about fashion at all, when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. It was a system for marking every kind of occasion, joyful or sorrowful, ordinary or rare, as worth acknowledging through the effort you put into how you appeared. Clothing was the vocabulary, respect was the sentence it was always spelling out. Even radio, the dominant entertainment of the era, reinforced this culture in a strange, indirect way. Announcers and performers dressed formally for broadcasts nobody in the audience could actually see, simply because the belief was that dressing properly changed how you carried yourself, and that carrying yourself well came through in your voice, even over the airwaves. Appearance and character were treated as connected all the way down. That belief, that dressing well changes your posture and your bearing even when nobody is watching, sounds almost old-fashioned to say out loud now, but it shows up again and again in the etiquette writing of the decade. Emily Post herself argued that good dress and good manners were simply 2 branches of the same tree, both rooted in consideration for other people and in self-respect that did not require an audience to matter. It is worth naming the misconception directly here because I hear it constantly in the comments on videos like this one. People assume this era's formality was imposed from above, a kind of oppressive social control women had no say in. But most of the enforcement mechanism was neighbors, mothers, and mirrors, not police or law, aside from the actual fabric rationing itself, which really was federal law with real penalties attached. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Fabric rationing was a rule with teeth, a violation with real consequences from the War Production Board. Wearing a hat downtown was a custom with no teeth at all, enforced entirely through the soft pressure of being noticed, judged silently, and occasionally gossiped about at the next church social. Both shaped behavior. Only one of them could put you in legal trouble. We should also be honest that this standard was not applied evenly across every American community, and pretending otherwise would flatten a more complicated history. Economic hardship hit harder in some households than others, and the burden of maintaining appearances on very little money fell disproportionately on women in poorer families, who often worked twice as hard for the same presentable result their wealthier neighbors achieved with far less effort. That gap does not erase the beauty in the story, but it deserves to sit alongside it honestly. A woman with fewer resources who still managed to look put together for church on Sunday was not doing something easier than her wealthier neighbor. She was doing something considerably harder, and the standard never adjusted itself downward to make room for that difference. It expected the same result from everyone, regardless of the starting line. Let us bring this back around to why any of it should matter to someone sitting comfortably in the present, tea in hand, watching a video about a decade that ended 80 years ago. It matters because the underlying instinct that showing up carefully for other people is a form of respect did not actually expire along with the rationing order that once enforced it by law. There has been a real, sustained pullback toward this way of thinking in recent years, showing up in slow fashion movements, in the popularity of mending and visible repair as a skill worth learning again, in the steady stream of interest in vintage tailoring and vintage etiquette that keeps channels exactly like this one alive. People are noticing in their own quiet way that something got lost when convenience replaced care completely. You do not need a fabric ration to bring a piece of this back into your own life, and I want to be careful here, because I'm not telling you to draw a fake seam up the back of your leg tomorrow morning. I am telling you the underlying habit is worth borrowing. Choose one small, unglamorous occasion this week, an ordinary errand, a quiet visit, and give it slightly more care than it strictly requires. That is the whole secret this generation of women understood and never had to say out loud, because it lived in every hat pinned in place before a 5-minute errand. Care is not really about the clothes at all. It is about deciding, quietly and without an audience, that the people around you and the version of yourself you show them are both worth a little more effort than the bare minimum requires. I keep coming back to that image of the pencil line drawn up the back of a woman's leg by her sister's steady hand. It is such a small, almost silly detail on its own. But it holds the whole story inside it: resourcefulness, cooperation, standards that refused to bend just because the materials ran short, and a quiet refusal to let hardship look like hardship in public. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it, and somewhere along the way, most of us stopped passing it down at all. Not because we decided it was wrong. It simply got crowded out by convenience, by casual dress codes, by a world that moves faster than a mother teaching her daughter to check her hem before answering the door. I do not think the answer is pretending we can go back to fabric rationing or pencil-drawn stocking seams, and I would not want to. But I do think there is real value in remembering that an entire generation faced genuine scarcity and chose, again and again, to meet it with care instead of surrender. That choice cost them nothing but attention, and it gave them back something we are still trying to name. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down, and if this video did nothing else tonight, I hope it handed a small piece of that back to you. Not the hat, not the gloves, not the pencil seam itself, but the instinct underneath all of it, the quiet decision to treat your own life and the people who share it with you as worth a little more care than the world currently asks of you. If this kind of forgotten history feels like something worth keeping alive, stay a while longer with me here at Clara's Forgotten Manners. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore, and I am doing my best, one video at a time, to make sure it does not disappear for good. Tell me in the comments which detail from tonight surprised you most, and I will see you in the next one.